Hi there! Tonight we travel back, way back, to a time of damp forests, dirt roads, and diets heavy on root vegetables, and things with names like peas porridge. Tonight we're going to find out exactly what it was like wiping your butt. In the Middle Ages, you're probably picturing castles and chainmail, maybe a bard humming in the distance. But imagine this instead. You've just finished a hearty meal of barley stew. Your stomach feels a little too lively, and there's no indoor plumbing for another 800 years. Nature is calling. Loudly, you step outside into the chill of a muddy twilight. The wind has picked up and the smell of livestock is unmistakable. There's a pit dug behind the cottage, loosely disguised by a wobbly wooden fence. You've been here before and you know this is not going to be glamorous. Tonight's journey may involve moss, sticks, rags, and possibly a small stone or two. You'll squat, you'll second-guess your choices, and you might whisper a prayer to St. Elmo, not the fire one, the patience one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still squatting in the dark, by the way. Your left foot has found a root, and your right is starting to fall asleep. You reach for what might be a leaf, but a voice in your head, probably your grandmother's, warns you to check first. In the Middle Ages, there's no shortage of plants, but not all of them are friendly. Some sting, some itch, and some cause unfortunate swelling in delicate areas. Historians still argue whether medieval folks knew which plants were safe to use or simply learned the hard way. One theory suggests that people developed wiping knowledge regionally, passed down, like recipes or lullabies. Another school of thought believes most folks experimented until they found something that didn't ruin their day or their week. A widely held assumption today is that wiping was simply primitive, as if everyone just grabbed anything lying around. But when you live in a world where infection can kill you, and comfort is rare, wiping becomes an art, a ritual, a survival tactic. Right now, you feel the breeze picking up again, carrying with it the sounds of distant cows and the chatter of neighbors stoking fires. You clutch your tunic, try to balance your dignity, and finally commit to a smooth-looking cluster of broad leaves. Fingers crossed. There's no toilet paper, no scented wipes, no extra gentle triple ply with cartoon puppies on the packaging. Just you, your instincts, and whatever the forest floor is willing to offer. As you stand, brush off your hands, and make your way back to the hut, you pass your neighbor. He's heading out with a chunk of straw in one hand and what looks suspiciously like a wooden spoon in the other. You nod, he nods. No words are exchanged. None are needed, because everyone knows what this moment is, and no one wants to talk about it. You kick off your muddy shoes at the door, wash your hands with the lukewarm water from the basin, someone's already used the good soap, and settle onto your straw-stuffed mattress. The fire crackles low. Somewhere a baby cries, somewhere else someone is learning what nettles feel like, and you think to yourself, we've only just begun. Morning arrives with the scent of damp hay, wood smoke, and something a little less pleasant drifting in from the back field. You stretch under your scratchy wool blanket, rub your eyes, and shuffle toward the hearth where breakfast, a chunker of rye bread and a cold turnip, awaits. But before long, that turnip's heading south. You pull on your boots, grab your hooded cloak, and step outside again into dew-soaked grass. The privy pit behind the cottage hasn't changed. It's still a shallow trench surrounded by half-hearted wooden planks and buzzing with flies. No door. No seat. Just you, your aim, and your options. Today, let's talk about those options: leaves, moss, and mystery plants. You look around. Nature is your bathroom cabinet, and like any poorly labeled medicine drawer, it's filled with surprises. Leaves, in theory, are ideal, soft, plentiful, and biodegradable, but in the Middle Ages you didn't exactly have a guidebook called Safe, Forest Wiping, a beginner's manual. You learned by watching others, or more often, by painful trial and error. Some leaves gave you a clean swipe. Others gave you a week of itching that even vinegar couldn't fix. The broadleaf dock was a favorite in many regions, cool to the touch, slightly absorbent, and mercifully sting-free. People also used mullein, often called nature's toilet, paper. It's fuzzy, it's big, and it looks a bit like a plant that was designed with only one job in mind, but then there's cowbane, which looks helpful until your backside is on fire. Or poison ivy's European cousin, which medieval folk couldn't name, but definitely remembered not to use twice. Historians still argue whether villagers truly knew plant names and properties, or simply avoided the ones that made them scream. You crouch now, scanning the greenery around you. You spot a promising cluster, leaves like small hands, gently curved and reaching up toward the sun. You brush one, soft and pliable. Maybe this is your lucky day, but let's not forget moss. Soft, squishy, and found just about everywhere, moss became the unsung hero of wiping for many medieval folks. Especially in wetter regions, Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia, moss was nature's gift. Some households even kept a basket of dried moss by the hearth, rehydrating it slightly before use. Think of it as an early kind of wet wipe. There's a fringe theory among scholars that moss was seen as cleaner than cloth because it was natural and easily disposed of. Others argue it was simply the easiest thing to grab when you were squatting near a stream and heard someone approaching. Of course, using moss isn't as simple as it sounds. Too dry and it crumbles, too wet and it becomes a mess. And some types have tiny barbs or insects nestled inside. A medieval field guide, if it had existed, might have warned, "Test thy moss before thou commit thyself." You bend over, pluck a bit of moss from the base of an old tree and run it between your fingers. It's cold, a little slimy, but not bad. Could be worse. Could be stinging nettle. In some places, pine needles were bundled into soft pads. In coastal villages, people used seaweed, a choice both slippery and slightly scented. Inland, clumps of straw twisted into makeshift wands made wiping possible, if not particularly luxurious. And yet, despite all these creative natural solutions, one truth remains: you had to act fast. Most privy spots were public or semi-public, and lingering meant risking both gossip and awkward eye contact, so you do your business quickly, wipe with a bit of dock leaf, finish up with a patch of moss, and cover the mess with dirt or leaves. Sanitary? By modern standards, not quite. But in a time when most people shared sleeping spaces, drinking bowls, and half their diseases, this was par for the course. As you walk back to the cottage, you glance at a nearby hedge. Someone else has just squatted there. You catch a glimpse of them standing, adjusting their robes and tossing a clump of moss over their shoulder like a victorious gladiator. This is the rhythm of life here, natural, necessary, and far more thoughtful than we give it credit for. You pass the hearth again and spot a small cloth laid out to dry. Tomorrow, you think, we'll talk about that, because not every day has good moss. Your boots are still damp from the morning dew, and you've only just finished your chores, gathering eggs, scattering grain, and trying not to get pecked by that one chicken who seems to have a personal vendetta. The sun is climbing. warm, on your shoulders, but your thoughts keep circling back to something soft, spongy, and always a little bit mysterious. Moss. It looks so inviting, doesn't it? A velvet blanket draped across tree roots and stones, glistening in the light. The kind of thing you'd almost nap on if it weren't growing out of a damp stump. But today, you're not thinking about sleep. You're thinking about wiping because, while we touched on moss already, you're now starting to see how central it really was. Especially if you lived near woodlands, moss was more than decoration. It was a tool of survival and comfort and occasional betrayal. There were many kinds of moss in the Middle Ages, but sphagnum moss was a standout. Found across northern Europe, it was known for being soft, highly absorbent, and mildly antiseptic. That's right, this moss didn't just wipe, it helped clean. Some even believe wounded knights packed it into injuries when cloth ran low, so if it was good enough for your sword gash, surely it was good enough for your rear. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the medicinal qualities of moss, or if it just felt better than everything else. Some monastic records suggest moss was deliberately gathered, dried, and stored in boxes labelled with little wooden tags, possibly for wiping, possibly for wounds, possibly both. That's medieval multitasking for you. Now imagine yourself walking into the woods with a small basket. You're not gathering mushrooms or berries. No, you're foraging for the good moss. Not too wet, not too crispy. Your hands hover over patches like a chef selecting basil. And here's where things get interesting. You're not the only one doing this. Villagers talk about moss, they recommend patches. They warn you not to take from the north side of the stone wall because, as old Marta says, it smells like goat, no matter how much ye rinse it. There's even a bit of folklore about it. In one village, parents would tell their children, that forest spirits live in moss, and if you used it without asking, you'd be cursed with itchy cheeks. A clever way to teach respect, or just a strategy to keep toddlers from grabbing handfuls of it at random. Quirky tidbit. In Scandinavian regions, some folklore claims that moss used in wiping should never be burned, or the smoke would carry your sins up to the sky. Better to bury it with a murmured prayer. You know, just in case, you press on through the brush and come across a shaded clearing, moss, thick and vibrant, blanketing the base of a crumbling tree. Jackpot. You kneel, inspect a section. It's firm but soft, not too damp, and free of insects. You take a palm-sized patch and tuck it into a pouch you've lined with dry cloth. This is the prize stuff. You'll save it for later, maybe tonight, when the stew hits your stomach like a brick and the outhouse feels miles away. Here's the thing. Moss wasn't always the first choice, but it was often the smart choice. Easier to gather than cloth, softer than sticks, and more dignified than a pine cone. Plus, it blended in, which meant fewer awkward moments when someone spotted you carrying a suspicious bundle back from the woods. Now you head back toward the village, your pouch softly rustling at your side. You pass the baker, who nods at you. You both know where you've been, but it's understood. No one talks about the moss bag. As the day stretches on and the chickens finally stop plotting your downfall, you begin to appreciate the little comforts, like the patch of moss you're saving, the same moss your grandmother probably used, and your children will too. Because in the end, some medieval tools didn't need to be reinvented, they just needed to be dry. Evening's coming on now, shadows stretching long across the muddy path that loops behind your cottage. The hens have retreated to their coop, the hearth glows with the promise of something warm, and your pouch of prized moss lies nearby, slightly damp but still perfectly respectable. But you know, moss can't always be trusted. There are rainy seasons, hard winters, and those moments when the nearest patch is just out of reach, or already occupied by something with teeth. So what do you use when nature fails you? wool, linen, straw. Welcome to the scratchier side of medieval hygiene. Imagine this. You're hunched over the wash tub, scrubbing a tunic that's more whole than fabric. Your eldest daughter eyes it skeptically. "Could be turned into rags," she says. And she's right. In a world where nothing is wasted, worn-out clothing has a second life, and often a rather personal one. Old linen shirts were cut into strips and repurposed into wiping cloths. Wool, if thin enough, might do in a pinch, though its texture could be assertive. These cloths were kept in baskets or hung on pegs near the privy. Some were even embroidered with little marks, so everyone in the household knew whose cloth was whose. A medieval version of colour-coded toothbrushes. Historians still argue whether personal wipes were common in peasant homes or more typical of wealthier households. Archaeological digs have uncovered scraps of textile near privy pits, but it's unclear whether they were for wiping or simply discarded garments. You kneel beside the fire now, reaching for a small stack of rags. One has a stitched border, another is so thin it's nearly transparent. You choose one, fold it twice and tuck it into your belt. Discreet, efficient, reusable. But with cloth came responsibility. After wiping, the cloth had to be rinsed, often, in a special basin by the garden or in a stream down the road. Then it would be boiled in lye, laid out to dry, and rotated back into the stack. Entire chore routines revolved around keeping those rags clean. In some homes, it was the job of the youngest child to collect them, using tongs or gloves made of old leather. And yes, there were accidents, a cloth misplaced, a guest who mistook a wiping rag for a hand towel. One travelling monk once wrote of being offered a napkin that smelled suspiciously like cabbage and shame. Straw, meanwhile, was the workhorse of wiping. Straw was everywhere, in your mattress, your roof, even your shoes. So why not your hygiene routine? Villagers would twist straw into short bundles, tie them with string, and use them as disposable wipes. Not soft, not elegant, but available. Sometimes straw was dipped in water or vinegar to soften it a little, or at least make it smell like effort had been made. And there's always the fringe solutions. A flat piece of bark, a square of leather. One traveller's diary mentioned wiping with a goose feather. Delicate, but distressing. In mountain regions, people reportedly used small cloth bags filled with sand or fine ash, dabbing rather, than wiping. Not exactly your spa day, but it worked. You finish your evening tasks and step out into the night, rags tucked neatly in a cloth bag at your hip. The stars peek out overhead. Your neighbour's dog howls once, then gives up. By now, you've accepted that comfort is relative. A soft cloth, even one with holes, can feel like luxury when your alternatives are straw or a snow-covered rock. And tomorrow, who knows, maybe it'll rain, maybe the moss will return, but tonight you'll sleep easy knowing your cloth is clean, folded and ready. Because sometimes peace of mind is just a square of linen away. Morning sunlight pours across the cottage floor, catching in the dust and warming your toes. You stretch beneath the woven blanket and consider skipping your usual trip behind the woodshed. But the barley stew you ate last night is staging a protest in your lower half and, well, you know how this story goes by now. You gather your wiping cloth, but something about today feels different. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe it's that conversation you half overheard in the village square, the one about a Roman thing with a sponge. Your neighbour Gertrude said the monks still used it. You decide to investigate. Welcome to the world of sponges and their unexpected medieval comeback. Long before the 3 seashells of futuristic fiction, the Romans had something called the tersorium, a stick with a sea sponge on the end. Communal latrines in ancient Rome often had these tucked-in vinegar jars between uses. Hygienic? Questionable. But clever? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether the tersorium tradition truly disappeared after Rome's fall or quietly persisted in certain settings, particularly monasteries, ships, and isolated communities where supplies were rationed and reuse was the rule. By the 12th century, some abbeys in England and France had detailed hygiene rules, and buried within those are references to shared cleansing tools, often rinsed in salt water, ash, or wine vinegar. What else could they mean? You walk along the narrow dirt path. That leads to the stone chapel at the edge of the woods. The monks there are quiet but kind, and they let locals borrow soap in emergencies. You peer into their latrine shed, more refined than your pit at home, and spot it, a wooden pole propped near the wall, its top wrapped in what looks like something spongy, could it be? One of the monks nods solemnly, noticing your curiosity. "We call it brother vinegar," he says, gesturing to the clay jug beside it. You manage not to laugh. He explains that the stick is cleaned after every use, soaked and hung to dry. "It's just like cleaning a cup," he says, "if everyone does their part." You nod, even as your stomach clenches at the idea of communal everything. But in ships where space was tight and fresh water precious, similar tools were used. Sailors sometimes tied rags or old ropes to sticks, dipped them overboard to clean, and reused them between stops. At least the ocean offered some rinse cycles. Back on land, certain monasteries had wiping schedules, yes, actual rotas, to make sure tools were used evenly and cleaned routinely. A friar might be in charge of vinegar one week and drying racks the next. Talk about divine dedication. Of course, not everyone had access to sponges, sea or otherwise. That didn't stop them from improvising. In coastal villages, washed-up sea creatures, porous stones, or even fish bladders, don't ask, were repurposed into soft-ish wiping tools. You can't help but admire the creativity, and there's something oddly comforting in the idea that monks, known for fasting and copying scrolls, also cared deeply about posteriors. You return home that afternoon with much to think about. Maybe your moss bundle is still the safer choice, but now you can't unsee the image of Brother Vinegar hanging politely on a hook, waiting its turn. You unpack your clean cloth, lay it in the sun, and consider, just for a moment, what it would take to make your own sponge stick. A branch from the willow tree, a bit of lichen. Maybe not today, but someday, because deep down, you know, in the Middle Ages, resourcefulness is the real luxury. The sun dips low, casting a golden haze across the edge of the forest. You're out gathering firewood, but your attention keeps drifting, because today you spotted something strange near the village stream. A polished stone, smooth as an egg, resting on a ledge like it had been placed there on purpose. At first, you figured someone skipped a stone and missed. But now you know better, because not everything in the woods is for skipping. Some things are for wiping. Tonight, let's talk about stones, shells, and smooth surprises. Yes, friend, in the Middle Ages, the right kind of rock could double as your toilet paper. And while it may sound absurd to modern ears, it wasn't as rare as you'd think. Let's start with the stone. Ideally, it was flat, oval-shaped, and smooth to the touch, often river-washed or hand-polished over time. A good wiping stone wasn't too heavy, but not too light either. If you'd use it to smooth butter over bread, you could probably use it here too, just not both. Historians still argue whether wiping stones were commonplace household items or personal oddities. There's mention of cleaning pebbles in some Norse sagas, and even fragments of smooth stones found near known latrine sites in ancient settlements across Europe and Asia. You're crouched now by the same stream, plucking up the mystery, stone. It fits perfectly in your palm, cool, weighty, oddly comforting. You turn it over, testing its edge. It's not so different from a river-smoothed skipping stone, but with more personal ambitions. There's something deeply medieval about it, using nature, sculpted by time, for the most human of needs. In coastal regions, particularly in the Mediterranean and northern France, people also used seashells. Flat clamshells, or scallop shells, rinsed and reused. The trick was finding shells with the right curvature, not too sharp, not too brittle. You didn't want your hygiene routine to turn into a crime scene. And yes, people knew the risks. There are records, whispers really, of nobles getting infections from poorly cleaned tools. One particularly dramatic tale involves a minor noblewoman who supposedly used an oyster shell with disastrous consequences, though, as with many medieval cautionary tales, the lesson was less about hygiene and more about humility. You pocket your stone, now nicknamed Smoothie, and head back toward the village. Your neighbor passes you with a reed basket full of eggs and eyes your hand suspiciously. "Find something useful?" she asks. You nod solemnly. Possibly life-changing. She doesn't ask more. Everyone's got their secrets. Of course, using a stone or shell came with cleanup responsibilities. Most users would rinse the stone in running water, dry it in the sun, and store it in a pouch lined with cloth or hay to keep it clean. Some even kept sets, one for home, one for travel. You know, for those long journeys where moss might be scarce. Quirky tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe, small carved wooden paddles were used, something between a spatula and a spoon. It's unclear whether they were made specifically for wiping, but let's just say they didn't stir soup as you light your evening candle and settle down for a modest dinner. The stone lies on a shelf by the window, drying. It's a simple thing, but in a world without plumbing, it's a marvel of practical design. One day, you think, people will flush porcelain thrones with buttons and sprays and not even wonder how it came to be. But tonight, you're grateful for the little rock. That could. Twilight deepens, and with it comes the quiet hush of the village settling in for the night. You light a stub of tallow candle and step out to breathe the crisp evening air. Somewhere nearby, a lute twangs out of tune, and someone yells at a bee, "Go, just another normal evening, but you're headed somewhere." Less musical. You take the winding path toward the edge of the square, past the blacksmith's, around the apothecary's cart, to a small stone building with a wooden door slightly ajar. This isn't your usual spot. This is something more social. You're about to experience the public latrine. Yes, in certain towns, especially growing medieval cities, public latrines existed, built over running water with long wooden benches and several, how shall we say, openings. These places were where people took care of business together. No walls, no stalls, no privacy. Just you, a few neighbors, and an awkward silence, or not. Because often these spaces were downright chatty. In cities like London, Paris, or Bruges, these communal houses of easement were located near the river, often built over bridges or piers. Waste flowed into the water below. And while that may sound horrifying today, it was considered a marvel of urban design back then. You step inside. The smell is noticeable, a mixture of wood, damp stone, and things better left unnamed. You find an open spot, nothing but a hole in a wooden plank, and sit. Across from you, someone nods. "Nice night," they say. You manage a grunt, and Then comes the wiping. In some public latrines, there were shared wiping tools, most famously the sponge on a stick, rinsed in vinegar between uses. Other times there was a bucket of cloth rags, each person responsible for taking and cleaning their own. A small corner may even have a basket of moss or straw, free for the taking. The system varied, but the social rules were unspoken and strict. Don't linger, don't comment on the smell, absolutely don't make eye contact during wiping. Historians still argue whether these places were gender separated. Some records suggest yes, others hint at a more relaxed, read chaotic, arrangement, especially during festivals when beer outpaced logic. And here's a quirky tidbit. In a few bustling cities, public latrines were maintained by guilds who even hired groomers. Yes, professional latrine attendants who handed out cloth, refilled vinegar jugs, and sometimes told stories to distract from the less pleasant bits. You sit a little longer than you should, not out of need, but because the atmosphere is oddly fascinating. The soft drip of water, the scratch of someone's sandal, the muffled conversation from outside. One man uses a small wooden paddle to clean himself, then dunks it in a bucket with practiced ease. You try not to think about how many people used it before him. He glances at you. You from the north? You shake your head. Thought so. Northerners don't talk. You offer a weak smile. Eventually, you stand, wipe with a moss bundle from your pouch, no offense to the paddle, and drop a pebble into the nearby rinse jar out of politeness. You leave the structure back into the cool air, grateful for your own humble pit back home. Public latrines were more than toilets. They were social spaces, community checkpoints, places where news, gossip, and smells circulated freely. They remind you that even the most private of acts can, in the right era, become remarkably public. And tomorrow you'll return to your moss and rag and stone. But tonight you've experienced something rare. Communal wiping, medieval style. You wake the next morning with the sound of bells echoing across the hills, deep, slow tolls that signal a wedding at the manor, or maybe just the baker oversleeping again. Either way, today feels different, because today you've been asked to help deliver bread to the castle kitchens, and that means access, not just to honey and butter and roasted things that smell like heaven, but to the castle privies, the ones you've only ever heard about in whispered awe. Because while your village latrine is a hole in the ground with personality, the ones in castles are said to be elevated, literally. You arrive at the gatehouse, basket in hand, and are waved through by a bored guard whose beard might be sentient. You pass stables, stone archways, and torch sconces blackened with old soot. Eventually, the cook, red-faced and yelling at a boy for dropping a goose, points you toward a quiet corridor and says, "If you need to go, do it before the midday feast. Don't stink up my kitchen." So, naturally, you explore. Welcome to the world of castles, cloisters, and chamber pots. Unlike peasants, who made do with shared pits and mossy privacy, the wealthy had garderobes, small stone rooms built into castle walls, often high above a moat or river. You enter one now. It's barely bigger than a wardrobe, hence the name, with a stone or wooden seat over a chute that plunges deep into the dark unknown. And yet, it's kind of magical. A slit window lets in a shaft of golden light. A little shelf holds folded rags, maybe even a scrap of velvet for guests only, surely. There's a faint scent of rosemary, perhaps burned in a brazier nearby to mask less poetic smells. Some garderobes doubled as storage rooms, too. Wealthy families believed that hanging fine garments over the latrine chute protected them from moths, thanks to the ammonia fumes rising up. Practical? Debatable? Fashion-forward? Absolutely not. Historians still argue whether the upper classes had regular wiping habits or simply used whatever was at hand: linen scraps, sponge sticks, imported paper. There are references in royal inventories to soft cloths for intimate duties, but specifics are, understandably, rare. Still, the presence of dedicated shelves, baskets of straw, or hanging cloth rolls suggests some thought went into it. Cloisters, monastic communities, had their own twist. Stone buildings with rows of seated holes, separated by thin partitions, and sometimes with drainage channels built below. Monks would bathe once a week and were expected to clean their wiping cloths with almost religious zeal. One abbey in Normandy even had a sanitation bell rung when someone forgot to wash their cloth after use. It was the medieval version of being called out in group chat. You settle onto the garderobe bench more out of curiosity than need. The seat is cold, your knees ache, but the view, well, it's a view. A river far below, birds wheeling overhead, and for a brief moment you feel like royalty. You pick up one of the cloths, noticing it's been folded into a triangle. Someone cared. Someone wiped with dignity here, and, next to the cloths, a small jar of rosewater, likely for perfume, possibly for rinsing. You sniff it cautiously and sneeze. Class smells like flowers and mildew. Later, in the great hall, as you unload bread and avoid a scullery boy juggling turnips, you catch whispers of the Queen's chamber pot, a gilded thing with painted vines and a cushioned rim. Chamber pots were the other luxury. In rooms too far from garderobes, nobles used ornate pots, sometimes disguised as stools or ottomans. Servants were tasked with emptying and cleaning them, sometimes carrying them down spiraling stone staircases before sunrise. You leave the castle with more than you came with, a mental picture of privileged wiping, scented rags, elevated views, and the realization that even kings and queens have their moments. Because no matter the tower height, everyone squats the same. You've barely made it back from the castle, boots still damp and your cloak dusted with flour, when you hear the soft chime of the chapel bell across the meadow. The monks are gathering for evening prayer, their silhouettes moving in slow procession beneath the stone arches. But tonight, you're not here for scripture. You're here to peek behind monastery doors and straight into the chamber of medieval monastic wiping. Because believe it or not, when it came to hygiene, monks had rules, strict ones. The cloistered life wasn't all chanting and gardening. Maintaining bodily purity was just as important as spiritual cleanliness. And that included what happened behind the latrine door. You slip through the side path under a cloister arch where ivy curls like a secret and follow the faint trickle of water. The monk's reredoter, that's the technical name for their communal latrine, is built beside a stream, elevated just enough to allow running water to carry waste away. Ingenious, really. You duck into the cool stone interior. It's quieter than a church, save for the distant splash of water. The room has rows of evenly spaced stone seats, some with wooden lids, others bare. No partitions, just a long bench of brotherly humility. At the end of the room is a wooden rack. Hanging from it, cloth wipes, dozens of them, some square, some triangle, some clearly repurposed from old tunics. Each monk had his own, usually marked with initials or coloured stitching. Sharing wasn't just unsanitary, it was unholy. Beside, the rack is a clay jug of vinegar water used for soaking and disinfecting the cloths after each use. There's even a small shelf labelled drying, the medieval equivalent of a hygiene station. And yes, there were rules, whole pages of them. Some orders prescribed how many wipes per visit, usually 3. Others dictated how often the cloth had to be washed daily, who could hang it, only the user, and where it could be stored, never near food, thankfully. Some even suggested meditative wiping, combining cleansing with contemplation. Historians still argue whether monks were truly more hygienic than lay people or just better at writing about it. What we do know is that some monasteries kept wiping logs, literally where infractions were recorded. Forget your cloth, that's a penance. Use your neighbours. Penance and public apology. Quirky tidbit. In a few monasteries, there was a designated wiping brother. No, really. Whose job was to ensure that cloths were rotated, laundered, and replaced when too threadbare. Some speculate he was also the one who checked the vinegar levels. You ease down onto one of the stone seats, not to use it, but just to sit. The coolness soaks into your bones. Above you, wooden rafters creak with age, and a spider dangles from a beam, spinning quietly, undisturbed. There's something peaceful here, in the rhythm of routines. Wake. Pray. Garden, copy manuscripts. Clean your cloth. Pray again. Even in wiping, there is order, and you can't help but feel a flicker of admiration. In a chaotic world of mud and war and roaming pigs, these monks found a way to turn personal hygiene into ritual. You rise, straighten your cloak, and take one last look at the cloth rack. A few of the wipes are embroidered with flowers. One has a faded symbol that looks suspiciously like a chicken. Maybe they were allowed a little creativity. As you step out into the fading light, bells ring again, this time signaling supper. Somewhere inside, cloths are being folded, jugs refilled, peace restored, and tonight you'll sleep a little easier, knowing that somewhere in the hills, Brother Wiping is on duty. You wake before dawn, not because of any urgent need, but because the rooster is apparently training for a career in opera. As you toss off your blanket and stretch your aching legs, you hear a soft rustle and a muttered curse from the next cottage. Your neighbour, old Maud, is already up. And that, oddly enough, leads your thoughts to a question people rarely ask aloud. How did children and the elderly manage wiping? You pull on your tunic and step outside, the ground cool beneath your feet, dew clinging to every blade of grass. The village is just beginning to stir, chimneys puffing, pots clanking, sheep looking confused as always. Today, you've agreed to help Maud fetch water. She's nearly 70, practically a miracle in your time, and her joints sound like someone crumpling parchment. She greets you with a nod, her eyes sharp as ever. "Walk slow," she says, "or I'll trip you." As you walk side by side, Maud talks about her childhood, about goats that ran away, and about wiping with vinegar-dipped straw, which, according to her, was better than the dry stuff, but made your behind smell like pickles. Children in the Middle Ages learned the art of wiping early. Not with flushable wipes or cartoon-themed toilet paper, but with whatever their parents used, leaves, moss, rags, or sand, if they lived near a river. And who did the wiping for toddlers? Often, older siblings or a grandmother like Maud. Diapers existed, sort of linen wraps changed infrequently and washed in boiling water. But when it came time to transition from diapers to wiping, kids were expected to adapt quickly. One quirky method? Wiping dolls. Small cloth bundles given to children to simulate the wiping process on themselves or their doll. It was educational. And messy. Back in my day, Maud says, pointing with her chin toward the stream, we used to make kids wipe with dock leaves until they learned which side stung. She chuckles to herself, and you wince in sympathy. Elders like Maud, though, had a different challenge: mobility. Kneeling over a pit latrine gets harder with age. So many resorted to chamber pots, often kept warm by the hearth and discreetly tucked behind curtains or chairs. Wiping was done sitting slowly and with soft cloths rinsed in herbal water, lavender, sage, or sometimes just salt. There's a quiet dignity in how the elderly handled these tasks. Some had long-handled wiping, sticks, especially if they had arthritis or bad knees. Others relied on caregivers, usually family members, or in wealthier homes, dedicated servants. Historians still argue whether elder care in the Middle Ages was widespread or limited to noble households. Records from certain nunneries and hospitals show detailed accounts of personal maintenance, including washings and assistance with the back end. In the monastery you visited yesterday, there's even a note carved into an old beam. Brother Thomas must not forget Sister Agnes's cloth on Thursdays. Whether this was a joke or a reminder, hard to say. You and Maud finally reached the stream. She lowers her bucket with practiced ease, then gestures to a flat stone nearby. That's my thinking rock, she says. And sometimes my wiping rock. Depends on the day. You both laugh, and as you help her lift the bucket, you realize there's something universal about this experience. From a baby's first moss leaf to an elder's carefully folded rag, the act of wiping connects every generation. Messy? Yes, but also kind of beautiful. You return to the village with Maud, walking slowly, listening to the rhythm of her footsteps beside yours. She hums an old tune, one that might be about goats, or love, or clean bums, you're not quite sure. But one thing is certain, in the grand history of hygiene, no one wipes alone. Back at your cottage, you take a moment to rest. The fire's burning low and your feet are sore, but your mind drifts, wondering not about royal banquets or plagues or wars, but something far more intimate and essential. What happens after the wipe? Sure, we've explored the many materials, moss, cloth, feathers, and yes, even stones, but wiping is only part of the equation, because the real question is, how do people in the Middle Ages store their wipes? How do they clean them? Where do they go? Welcome to the cloth bucket system. In households across the countryside, a typical day might involve wiping with a scrap of linen or an old tunic sleeve that's seen better days. But these weren't disposable. Oh no, these were multi-use, multi-person, and, in the right family, practically heirlooms. You step outside and walk a few paces to the side of your small home, where a wooden bucket, partially covered with a cloth, sits tucked near the fence. This is your wiping bucket. Inside are several balled-up rags, some damp, some dry, all waiting for their next trip to the wash. In many homes there were two buckets, one for clean cloths, neatly folded, and another for used ones soaking in, a mild lye solution or vinegar water mixture. The buckets were rotated daily, and the cloths were boiled over a fire, scrubbed with ash or soapwort, and left to dry in the sun. It's not glamorous. It's not fast, but it's hygienic, at least by the standards of the time. Quirky detail. Some families stitched different coloured threads into corners of the cloths to designate ownership. Blue for father, red for mother, green for the kids. In larger homes, cloths might be embroidered with initials or symbols, because nothing says love like not using someone else's butt rag. You grab a clean cloth and head to your backyard latrine, a small structure, just a pit with a plank over it, surrounded by rough-hewn boards. As you squat in the morning chill, a neighbour's rooster announces something aggressively unimportant. You finish up, fold the cloth carefully, and return it to the used bucket, tucking it under the cloth cover to keep flies out. Later, you'll boil it with the others in a big iron pot, maybe with some thyme thrown in to fight the funk. Historians still argue how widely the cloth bucket system was used. Was it every home, or just the more fastidious? Some believe it was limited to colder climates where moss was less available, while others argue it became the standard for households with enough linen to spare. Regardless, in a world where cloth was expensive and hard to come by, reusing it, even for wiping, was just common sense. In wealthier homes, the system was more refined. Cloths were laundered in copper basins, dried on wooden racks near the fire, and occasionally sprinkled with herbal oil blends, rosemary, lavender, or mint. Guests might even be offered a fresh square of linen tied with a ribbon, like the world's weirdest party favor. You remember hearing about a traveling merchant who sold wiping kits, a pouch of cloths, a small bottle of rinse water, and a personal drying string, like a toiletry bag, but medieval and considerably more rustic. You finish your chores, wash your hands with a splash from the rain barrel, and watch as your cloths steam gently in the noonday sun, drying beside the cabbages. It's strange how something so private becomes part of the daily rhythm. Wipe, rinse, boil, repeat. But here in your little village, it's just another chore, just another Tuesday. And despite the lack of plumbing, antibacterial soap, or Charmin Ultra, there's a certain grounded dignity in how people handled their business, with care, with consistency, and with cloth. You're back on the road again, boots caked in yesterday's mud, your pack bumping against your shoulder, and the faint smell of pickled onions haunting your breath from breakfast. The sun is kind today, filtered by passing clouds, and the path before you winds lazily toward a neighboring town where your cousin's wedding is taking place. Traveling in the Middle Ages, even for short distances, is always an adventure. There are no roadside inns with private bathrooms or gas stations with paper towels. If you need to relieve yourself, you find a bush and hope for the best. And when it comes to wiping, well, welcome to the wonderfully inconvenient world of on-the-road hygiene. You veer off the path into a small grove because the stone wall you passed 5 minutes ago offered about as much privacy as a parade float. Here, among the wildflowers and brambles, you find a decent spot. Flattish ground, shade, no visible thistles. It'll do. But wiping while traveling requires preparation. In your pouch, along with a crust of bread and a bit of cheese wrapped in cloth, you carry your wiping roll, a small linen wrap containing 3 folded cloth squares, a string of tightly bound moss, and a tiny flask of herb water, a concoction your aunt swears by for post-wipe comfort. You squat, do your business, and thank past you for not forgetting the cloth. Even seasoned travelers forget sometimes, and that leads to desperate improvisations, leaves, grass, feathers from the roadside, or worst of all, handkerchiefs you promised never to use for that purpose. Historians still argue how standardized these travel kits were. Did most people carry wiping cloths with them, or was it a luxury of the slightly better off? Some sources suggest traveling merchants and clergy carried entire bundles, while poorer folks relied entirely on nature's offerings. Quirky side note: in some parts of medieval Europe, especially mountainous regions, smooth bark from birch trees was prized as an emergency wipe, thin, pliable, and surprisingly durable. In a pinch, your belt knife could shave off a bit. Just be sure it's not resin heavy, or you'll be stuck in more ways than one. You return your cloth to a waxed leather pouch, separate from the food, obviously, and tie it off. You'll wash it at the next stream, or maybe the one after that. As you walk, you pass a group of pilgrims, dusty and singing. They carry staffs, bedrolls, and one of them, an older woman with twinkling eyes, has a strip of rags tied to her walking stick, drying in the breeze. You smile. She winks. You keep walking. For longer trips, travellers sometimes buried their wipes, especially if they used cloth. Others washed them in roadside streams or hung them in trees to dry, though this invited unwanted attention from squirrels and the occasional sheep. And if you're lucky enough to find a tavern along your route, there might be a shared privy, a wooden outhouse out back, often with a bucket of straw or even a roll of coarse paper if the owner was feeling generous. But more often than not, it's just a plank, a hole, and a questionable smell. You reach a stream by midday and kneel beside it, untying your pouch. The cloth is stained but still usable. You rinse it, scrub it with a smooth rock, and hang it on a low branch while you rest. As it flutters in the breeze, you snack on the bread and cheese, listening to birds and pretending you're a noble on a grand journey rather than a tired traveller with damp wipes. Because out here, on the dusty road, everyone's equal in the eyes of nature. No thrones, no garderobes, just you, your cloth, and a really judgmental-looking squirrel. You reach the village just before dusk. Smoke curls from chimneys, children chase each other across packed earth, and the church bell tolls low and slow. Your cousin's wedding feast is tomorrow, but tonight you're staying with her in-laws. Kind people with a cramped cottage and, as you soon discover, no intention of walking to the privy in the dark. Because now, as the sun sets and the world turns shadowy and uncertain, you get a new lesson in medieval sanitation, night pots, and midnight scrambles. The cottage you're staying in is warm but crowded. There's barely room for the straw pallets, let alone privacy. So when nature calls after nightfall, people don't fumble down muddy paths to outdoor latrines. Instead, they reach under the bed, literally. You watch as your cousin's mother pulls out a clay chamber pot, wide-mouthed and plain. "We call it the nightjar," she says, setting it on a cloth mat beside the hearth. It's not fancy, not perfumed, but it's practical. Most homes had one. Some had two. Richer folks had enamelled or decorated versions, but here in a humble household it's just clay and a sense of urgency. You realise quickly that wiping in the dark comes with its own rituals. There's no candle, you don't waste wax on a wee, and the cloths are kept nearby, rolled neatly in a small wooden box. Each one has been pre-moistened with rosewater and vinegar because waking up to scrub is no one's idea of rest. You try it later, after waking from a dream involving bees and communal sponge sticks. The pot is warmish from being near the hearth. You do your business quickly, carefully, and reach for the cloth. It's damp, faintly floral, and oddly soothing. You place the used cloth into a small, covered bucket, also under the bed, and return to sleep, vaguely proud of how efficiently you've just wiped in total darkness. Historians still argue whether most peasants had chamber pots or relied solely on outdoor solutions. In crowded cities, night pots were essential. Walking to a shared latrine after dark was dangerous, and some people simply emptied their pots out the window in the morning. Yes, that's where garde l'eau comes from. French for watch, out for the water, which wasn't water at all. Quirky detail. In some households, the oldest cloths were reserved for night wipes, considered more forgiving of mistakes. Others used pre-cut wool scraps soaked in herbs to keep spirits away during vulnerable nighttime moments. Back in your cousin's cottage, you wake just before dawn to the sound of the night pot being emptied. She carries it out with practiced ease, pours it into a shallow pit, rinses it with water, and sets it upside down to dry. Wiping cloths are washed later, after the morning chores are done. You offer to help, and she hands you a pair of tongs. "Just don't mix them up with the cooking ones," she says with a grin. As the fire crackles and the first beams of light peek through the shutters, you realize something. Wiping in the dark isn't just a necessity, it's a whole system, a quiet dance of cloth and clay, scent and memory. And whether you're in a manor, monastery, or tiny home with 7 snoring relatives, the need doesn't change. You just learn to navigate it quietly, carefully, and with a surprising amount of grace. Morning settles like a blanket over the village, golden and slow. Chickens scratch the dirt, carts creak in the distance, and well, you're already elbow deep in yesterday's wiping cloths, helping your cousin with laundry. Because now, with all this used fabric, the next question becomes inescapable. What did people do with the dirty stuff? This isn't modern life with landfill options and flushable convenience. In the Middle Ages, disposal required planning, repetition, and a fair bit of nose-holding. Here in the cottage yard, a large cauldron bubbles gently over the fire. Inside, water, ashes, and chopped soapwort root, the go-to cleanser for rural families. Your cousin tosses in cloth after cloth, each previously soaked in a mild lye solution. She stirs the mixture with a wooden pole that's absolutely never used for soup. Some of the cloths will be boiled, dried, and reused. Others, especially the badly torn or stiff with age, won't make the cut, which raises the age-old question: reuse, burn, or bury? For many, especially in cities, the answer was burning, but firewood was expensive, and even basic fuel like peat or dried dung was too precious to waste on soiled linens. So unless a cloth was truly beyond redemption, it lived to wipe another day. Out here, where trees are scarce and ash must be saved for cooking fires, disposal is selective. A badly stained cloth might be buried in the compost heap, where it breaks down slowly alongside vegetable peels and fish bones. Some households dedicated a waste ditch, a shallow trench where rags and other refuse went to decompose. Historians still debate whether these cloths truly broke down naturally or just lingered. Excavations in medieval settlements have turned up surprising quantities of fabric in latrine pits, some of which were remarkably preserved by the anaerobic environment, which is both fascinating and fragrant. Quirky fact: in some manors there was a rag steward, a servant tasked with sorting cloth into fine, acceptable and unacceptable piles based on texture and condition. Their job wasn't just laundry, it was logistics. Which cloth went, where and when. A surprising number of estate records list cloth inventory, often noting when a bundle was downgraded from table use to personal hygiene. You fish a clean cloth from the steaming cauldron with a stick and lay it flat on a sun-warmed plank. The smell is earthy and herbal, a kind of victory. Your cousin nods in approval and points to the drying rack, a simple frame of branches lashed together, angled to catch the morning breeze. By midday, most of the reusable cloths will be dry. The rest will be tucked away or consigned to the compost. In wealthier homes, disposal might involve incineration in kitchen hearths or tossing into the manor's refuse pit. In monasteries, worn cloths could be repurposed, cut into candle wicks, fire starters, or even doll stuffing. Nothing went to waste without a second thought. You step back and survey the rows of cloth fluttering gently like strange, intimate flags. Each one holds a story. A traveller's roadside emergency, a monk's regulated wipe, a child's first successful squat. And now they begin again. You wipe your hands on your tunic and take a breath of the fresh morning air. It smells faintly of lavender, smoke, and the satisfaction of a job done thoroughly, if not glamorously. Because in the Middle Ages, hygiene was never glamorous, but it was resourceful. And as you hang the last cloth, sun glinting off the cauldron, you realize something simple and oddly reassuring. People back then didn't have less dignity, just fewer options. You leave the drying cloths to flutter in the breeze and wander up the hillside behind the village. It's quiet up here, just the wind in the tall grass, the clink of sheep bells somewhere below, and the distant rhythm of life in a world without. Plumbing. You sit beneath a twisted oak, your back to the bark, the view stretching wide. And as your thoughts drift past rags and moss, chamber pots and vinegar, you realize something surprisingly profound. Everyone wiped. Every single one. Kings on gilded thrones with embroidered linen, beggars in alleyways with smooth pebbles, pilgrims, farmers, blacksmiths, monks, midwives, bakers, nuns. They all faced that same quiet, private moment. There's a kind of humble democracy to it. No amount of gold or piety spared anyone from the realities of digestion. In the castles, noble ladies had attendants, small cloth bundles with embroidered initials, and bowls of warm water scented with thyme. They may have looked serene, powdered, divine. But even they asked at some point, "Where's my cloth?" In the fields, peasants squatted behind hedgerows, maybe using leaves or old wool scraps tied to their belts. The tools were different. The position wasn't. In the monasteries, Brother Edmund followed the rule: 2 cloths per week, washed under supervision, and no wiping during prayer hours. The discipline was spiritual, the action was still wiping. And in the back alleys of bustling medieval towns, amid chamber pots, chickens, and fishmongers yelling about eels, children learned by example. Watch, wipe, rinse, repeat. Historians still argue whether wiping habits were culturally dictated or purely practical. Some regions favored water over cloth, especially in warmer climates where streams were plentiful. Others believed certain herbs warded off illness, hence the mint-soaked wipes, the sage bundles, the occasional superstition about left-handed wiping bringing bad luck. You remember that, don't you? The debate from earlier, left hand or right. Turns out, most people used their non-dominant hand, keeping the stronger one clean for eating and prayer. Hence why shaking with the left was considered rude. It was, quite literally, the wiping hand. One quirky belief that wiping with dock leaves during a full moon would protect you from backaches. No proof, obviously, but who's arguing with? Someone holding a handful of leaves and no pants? As the sun leans westward and the sheep drift closer, you think of the cloths drying behind the house, of Maud and her vinegar straw memories, of travellers with pouches and moss bundles, of children learning, elders slowing, and the rhythmic dignity of cloth in water again and again. Because that's what wiping was, not gross, not shameful, not taboo, just life. You rise slowly, stretch, and walk back down the hill as the bells ring for evening bread. Inside, your cousin sets a fresh pile of folded cloths near the hearth, tied with twine, smelling faintly of rosemary. Tomorrow someone else will use them, and the quiet ritual will continue, soft, personal, invisible, but universal. Because wiping, strange as it sounds, is one of the few things we all do, and always have. The hearth crackles low as the last cloth is folded and tucked away. Outside, stars begin to shimmer behind thinning clouds, and the village yawns into sleep. You lie down on your straw pallet, body relaxed, breath deepening. The world has quieted, no carts, no clattering pans, not even the rooster with his misplaced ambition. Just the soft rustle of cloth in the night air, and the whisper of wind through wooden slats. And here, in the stillness, let the memory of moss underfoot and warm water over hands soothe you. Let it all drift backward into the rhythm of boiling, pots and drying cloths, the chuckle of old Maud, the birch bark tucked in a traveller's belt, the flick of rose water from a noble woman's handmaid. Let go of the images now. Let them fade like footprints in wet grass. There's something reassuring in the knowledge that for all the castles and cathedrals, nights and plagues, songs and wars, every single one of them paused for a moment, however humbling, and wiped, and then moved on with their day, just like you. So rest now, let your breath slow, let the fire's glow soften behind your eyes. You are warm, you are safe, and for once in this sprawling, complicated, ridiculous world, everything is done. Good night, sweet dreams.